Good morning, well, it's still morning. Good morning, and thank everyone for coming today. I was asked to address 5 questions in my talk today, and I'm going to endeavor to do this in the 20 minutes. The first is to give an idea of what are the land use impacts of a shift to healthier diets if a large percentage of the U.S. population were to do this. Second, how are we projecting the impact of diet on land use? How do we track land use? And how do we evaluate impacts on land use? Third, if we see that land use has an impact on diet, should that influence dietary guidelines? Should we consider sustainability in dietary guidelines? Fourth, are there indicators that are helpful to trying to measure environmental impacts? And then 5, how do we evaluate the impacts and balance the trade-offs between health and environment? So I want to start this story by going back to 1998. In the late 90s, the USDA Economic Research Service issued a publication called America's Eating Habits. And in that, they provided a translation of the food supply data into an estimate of what they thought people were consuming after accounting for losses that occur in the food supply. Now, this has been updated, and most recently in 2008, what you're able to see by using these annually collected food supply data is to compare where the guidelines are, and this was done before my plate, so you see my pyramid recommendations there up at the top, and compare how the major food groups compare to that recommendation. And you can see that for the grain food group and the meat and eggs and nuts food group, consumption, as evidenced by the food supply data, appears to be above the recommendation, and vegetables, dairy, and fruit falling well below the recommendations. So that gives you a baseline for understanding what direction would things need to shift if the population were to wake up and start following the dietary guidelines. Now, ERS made an attempt, 2 attempts actually, to try to estimate what that land use impact would be if the hypothetical being folks woke up and followed the pyramid. And here we have data from 2006 showing what they came up with. And it doesn't show all the food groups, and I'll get to that in a moment. What it shows is the area that was harvested in their baseline period, which was 1999 to 2003. It shows the adjustments that would need to occur in order to supply 100% of the people with enough food to meet the guidelines, assuming that it was distributed evenly. And then what would be the acreage needed when you combine current acreage in that period to the adjustment. So what they found was not particularly surprising given the disparity between the food groups and the dietary guidelines. You see that a big increase would be expected for fruit. We're talking about a doubling of fruit acreage. For vegetables, you also see a big increase, but it really depends on what part of the vegetable food group you're talking about. If you're talking about dark green and orange vegetables or legumes, you're talking about very large increases, whereas for starchy vegetables like potatoes, you're talking about a decrease. Then for the grains portion, they didn't look at all grains, they just looked at wheat. They predicted or projected there'd be a decrease, and that's in part to bring down that consumption to be equal to the actual guideline as opposed to exceeding it. They did not indicate what the land use impacts would be of dairy, and I'll describe why in a moment. But if you look at the overall effect, we're talking about a change of about 7.4 million acres. Now, out of the subtotal for these categories, that looks like a relatively large change. And for certain food groups, it is a large change. And it begs questions like, where will we grow this extra 100% of our fruit production? But in terms of total land area, that's very small. Harvested acreage of the United States is about 300 million acres in rough terms, so it's only a few percent. So this begs the question, what about the other food groups? Well, an earlier publication by Young and Cantor, also of the ERS, did look at the other food groups, and I'll describe what they found about sweeteners and about meat and added fats. So for the sweeteners, the story was very straightforward. Sweeteners would need to decrease to bring the diet in line, or at least the food supply in line with the dietary recommendations, and that would translate to about a 67% reduction in land area of those crops. and it would affect the sweetener crops, sugar beet, sugar cane, and corn used for corn sweeteners. With the meat and added fats, they didn't reach what I would say was a very satisfactory conclusion, but I think it was an honest conclusion that it's a very complex story. And part of it is because the dietary guidelines recommend more lean meat, and to get more lean meat, you need to usually have more animals because you're discarding either fattier cuts or portions of that meat. Over time, you can breed for leaner animals, but in the short term, it means you need more animals. And the land use implications of changing livestock product consumption affects feed grains, and it also affects oil seeds. Because soybean is our primary oilseed crop in the U.S., which we use for vegetable oils and things like salad oil, it's also a major livestock feed component. And what they concluded was that essentially trade resolves the mismatch that you have between needing to decrease oil on the one hand, but maintain livestock production on the other hand. And that's where all of the messiness in the data gets sent. It gets handled by trading it elsewhere to countries that will purchase it. Okay, so that's a very reasonable conclusion, and what it says is that even if diets change here, what we see in terms of U.S. land use may or may not reflect that because of the complexities of trade. So another way of trying to slice this story up is to understand what would the land requirements be to provide a complete diet. Understanding that we need to address the trade issue at some point, but looking at just the footprint of that diet. And here's a schematic that provides a simplified picture of an approach that I used to answer this question. It was answered in the context of New York State, and I'm working on a version for the US, but it's not quite done yet, so I couldn't share those results yet. But the methodology is the same, and it's basically a two-step process. You start with an estimate of what food intake would need to be for this diet, whatever this diet is that you're interested in. Account for losses that occur in the food supply chain and estimate the amount of edible food you would need to supply that intake. Account for processing and other losses that occur in the supply chain and estimate how many agricultural commodities you need. So bushels of wheat, pounds of carcass, things of that nature. The second step is then to estimate land needs, which is partially estimating the crop needs for livestock, and then also figuring out, based on the productivity of the U.S. agriculture, how much land would be required to produce those crops. That's in essence the story, with a little bit of adjustments for double counting. And what you see when you look at this in the context of a complete diet is the following. This project looked at 42 different diets. They varied in terms of how much meat they contained and how much fat they contained, but they were complete. Each diet had 2,300 calories per person. It contained representatives from all food groups, but they differed in terms of the meat and fat. So the meat ranged from a vegetarian diet all the way up to 381 grams, which was the equivalent of 12 cooked ounces of meat. So basically from a vegetarian diet to something like an Atkins diet. And the fat ranged from 20 to 45% of calories from fat. What you see here are land requirements per person per year. The basic story is pretty simple. As you increase meat in the diet, land requirements per person increase. However, you can see I've got it divided into two sections. We've got cultivated crops shown in brown, and that's mostly annual crop production. And then perennial crops here shown in green, which is primarily hay and pasture. And the changes don't occur at the same rate. So we're talking about two different pieces of the land base. What does this mean for sort of relative to current consumption? Well, current consumption of this food group, according to the 2009 food supply data, is about 6.5 servings, which puts us somewhere in between these two bars. The point I want to make here is that the change you see between where we are here, which is about the middle of the graph, and the vegetarian diet is over a twofold difference. So the assumptions made about what constitutes healthy eating with respect to meat is incredibly important in terms of trying to understand what the impacts will be on land use. So the story we get from ERS is not quite complete. Okay, so where does that bring us? Let's transition now to talk about other ways we might project the impacts of dietary change on land use. And I like to distinguish between three methods, all of which are in operation today. They're, in many cases, sort of evolving to address this issue of diet and not just land use, but environmental impacts generally. And one is economic modeling. An example of that would be the impact model by IFPRI. And in economic models, you're trying to model demand and the potential supply given that demand. Another approach is life cycle assessment, which I won't talk about in detail, but here we're looking at trying to apportion the impact, in this case land use impact, of different dietary patterns based on what we've observed. And then third, we've got biophysical modeling. I would put my work in that category. Another example is Worsenius's work. And here, rather than concentrating on economic drivers, we're really focusing on the biological and physical factors that constrain and shape what the land requirements of a diet would be. My point for showing them here, triangulating towards this green picture of land needs, is that they're all providing unique pieces to that story. And I think together they give us the complete picture. Okay. So if it's possible to get a better understanding of how diet shifts would likely impact land use, how do we actually track that? Well, the good news is that we've got lots of data sources for tracking this, and they're getting better. In terms of temporal trends, we've got crop production surveys, which are done annually by National Ag Statistics Service, and we have a 5-year census of agriculture that gives us literally a 150-year time series of data on land use on farms. We also have data on spatial patterns, which comes out of a data source known as the National Land Cover Dataset. It breaks land use into major categories like forest and agriculture and wetlands. And then the cropland data layer, which is very new and which actually gets down to individual crops and is released annually now by USDA for the past 5 years. And then finally, we've got data on land use change, which comes out of USDA National Resource Conservation Service. And this data is looking at what is land coming from and going into. So how much land over time is staying in cropland versus going to some other type of land use. And as you'll see in a minute, all of them are important to understanding the sustainability impacts. Okay, so if we can track land use and how it's changing over space, time, and over at a given point in space over time, how do we evaluate that? And here's an area where there really is debate in the literature. And we've got two hypotheses. I wouldn't quite call them competing, but they're definitely contrasting. One is the land-sparing hypothesis. And that hypothesis basically holds that increased yields spare land from conversion to agriculture. And as a result, you're leaving more undisturbed habitat, presumably for biodiversity, and in some cases for other ecosystem services, such as protection of soil or water recharge. And in this hypothesis, reducing land and agriculture is generally seen as an environmental good. We're reducing the footprint. Now, in contrast to that, we have the land sharing hypothesis, and much of this comes out of the conservation biology literature. Here, agricultural systems are seen as having the potential to both accommodate harvest for food, but also provide benefits and habitat for wildlife. And the focus in this group is what are the negative social and ecological consequences of intensification. And under this model, reduction of land and agriculture may not be an environmental good. Okay, so as I said, there's a debate going on, and which side of the debate should you fall on? I'm not going to answer that question, but I will say that there's some helpful indicators that give some direction on where I think the consensus is, and also what we need to be measuring. So the question is, are there helpful indicators to understand the environmental impact of land use change? And I would say that no single measure is going to suffice, so start there. That said, I also don't think it's reasonable to get caught in thinking this is hopelessly complex. A couple of papers in the last few years have made the contention that we should limit agriculture to the current footprint. And this was actually mentioned in an earlier talk. And if that's the case, that we're going to limit that, then there's a couple of things we need to look at to make sure that we've got enough land for food security. One of those, an example of one of those would be land that's in reserve, like the Conservation Reserve Program, but it could be some other form of reserve. And the yield gap, this idea of what's the difference between potential yields and actual yields. These things give us a measure of, if we stuck to the existing land, how much room do we have for error if population were to grow, if diets were to change, if anything were to change drastically. The other piece I want to talk about is that when we are looking specifically at the environmental indicators or environmental impact of land use change, there are a suite of indicators that are important. I listed just a few here. So we've got greenhouse gas emissions, CO2, CH4, and N2O, all of which are impacted by land use. Carbon storage, which can be impacted by the form of land use, erosion, losses of nitrogen, phosphorus, and sediment to water bodies, biological diversity, and you could add more. The question is, all of these are important, so if you want to know what the actual impact of land use change is, you need to be looking at all of them. And to give a concrete example, I'm going to provide an example from the literature on biofuels. It came out 5 years ago. You may have seen papers on carbon debt. There was a bit of a hubbub in science at that time. And here was one of the papers. The idea of carbon debt is that producing renewable fuels is a way of essentially reducing the environmental impact of energy production. What they're contrasting against here is how many years does it take to pay back the carbon that's released when you change land from one type of ecosystem to another. And the main point that you're to take home from this is that it varies a great deal. If you're starting with something like marginal cropland or abandoned cropland in the US, and you're switching to a cellulosic ethanol system, which is very efficient, you're looking at a payback period of maybe a year. Whereas if you're looking at a biodiesel system in a rainforest, you're talking about maybe 100 or hundreds of years. The reason this is important is that land use change in the US, if we want to keep this land in production and avoid bringing this land into production. So just seeing a change doesn't necessarily tell you whether it's a change that's positive or negative. You have to go back to the actual indicator you're interested in. It doesn't mean much out of context. Okay, so let's assume that we have enough data to understand the context of the environmental impact of land use change. How do we then weigh environmental benefits versus health benefits? And I think there's potential here to begin to make these balances. And I offer just a couple of examples. On the left, you've got examples labeled ethical synergy, which means we have a dietary shift that, as far as we know, should be positive for health and should also be positive, in this case, in terms of land use change. So I've got two examples, eating more legumes and reducing sugars. Both based on dietary guidelines would improve health, and both would have a reduction, at least in the case of legumes, relative to relying on meat as a protein source. On the right-hand side, we've got ethical dilemmas, and one which was talked about in depth earlier was fish consumption, so I won't talk about that much here. The other is increasing lean meats, where there's presumably a health benefit, but there's also going to be a greater land impact by following this recommendation to eat more lean meats. So it puts us in a bit of a quandary. You're now forced to make a comparison between two competing sets of value systems, and how do you make that decision? I don't think that's something that needs to be walked away from, but I think in terms of dietary guidelines, this is an easy way to classify the choices that you're faced with. A case where they're in lockstep with another, and then a case where they're in conflict with another. Now, one of the other questions I was asked to address was if there is a potential impact on food availability, should we consider this in dietary guidelines? And my quick response to that would be I think it is appropriate to begin to consider that. This diagram represents an argument made about agriculture by Welch and Graham in the late 90s, and they categorized agricultural thinking as starting with a production paradigm that focused on increasing output and increasing economic efficiency, and how it changed to one that started to consider sustainability impacts, ecological impacts specifically. And they were advocating for an even broader paradigm that would encompass health, environment, and production. It's been said before in different ways, but I think that's where we stand now, so I think it's an appropriate way to begin looking at the guidelines. So to summarize a few points, one, the land use impact of diet, the jury is still out. The impacts shown by ERS suggest it's a modest overall impact, except in some food groups, but meat consumption makes a big difference in how we view what the implications of dietary change would be. Second, I think we have the tools we need both to begin projecting the impacts of dietary change and in tracking land use. The evaluation of impacts is complex, and it requires multiple indicators, but this idea of land sparing provides a useful rubric in at least having a starting point for where do we start from with this issue. And then finally, if dietary guidelines are to consider sustainability, it should of course be within the bounds of the available evidence, and the key thing is going to be identifying where the trade-offs lie. With that, thank you very much.
Thank you, Christian. Our next speaker is Martin Heller from the University of Michigan, and he's going to integrate a lot of these data into a life cycle analysis discussion.